Good people, it's been a few days since Ant Edwards, who I like as a player by the way, made his egregious statement that only MJ and Kobe had skills in their era, and many people have gone at him for his opinion, understandably so. I have a different take than his, and it's pretty simple in its core, but today's NBA players do not have as much skill as players in those past generations, in my opinion. Now, I do know that when you talk about NBA players, the ones back from the 50s, 60s, all the way up to today, that the rules and the style of play in each era is different. So it's very hard to kind of quantify which era had more skill in it because you have to compare those players, in my opinion, relatively to what was happening in their era. I think that's the best way to do it because otherwise, like for example, when people say players today couldn't play back then, that's true, just like players back then couldn't play today if you just dropped them in, right? But I think if each player who's in the NBA, especially the superstar players, had the ability to adapt, I do think that they could adjust to the era and actually succeed and thrive in the league. Having said that though, anytime I hear anybody talk about today's players being more skilled, I always hear it under the context or the guise of, well, it's because of evolution, which really can't be measured. Well, I guess it can if you look at the numbers. They always talk about how they can handle the ball better. And then last but not least, they can shoot better. And by better, they mean the three ball in a lot of context when they say that. Though some of that I actually agree with is true, none of that makes them more skilled in my opinion, and let me explain why. First, let's take a look at the claim of ball handling being better than in the past, and the answer as to why this is kind of twofold. So there's a rumor or talking point that gets used a lot about how the rules changed and it allowed players to have their hand on the side of the ball and even slightly under the basketball, which technically isn't true. So what happened in a nutshell, to the long and short of it, if you will, was the interpretation of the rule by the league and the referees got a lot more lax, really starting in the 1980s after David Stern became commissioner because he saw where that would allow players to have a bit more, movement with the basketball that would allow for a better style of play and maybe a little bit more creativity in the game. The rule actually states, if you read it, that a player who is dribbling may not put any part of his hand under the ball and carry it from one point to another or bring it to a pause and then continue to dribble again. The rule didn't change, but as more and more time went on through the 80s, the 90s to 2000s, all the way to, the league we see today, it just allows players to get away with more within this rule. Therefore, ball handling, in my opinion, really isn't better. There's just more things allowed, if that makes sense. The second point as to why ball handling isn't better today compared to when it was before is the point of being able to handle the ball is to be able to get past your opponent and get to your spot to actually score or assist the basketball. When you look at players in the past, they used minimum dribbling to do this, and since the lane was also clogged, with bigs, being able to finish in traffic was very difficult, way more difficult than it is today. I'm playing some basketball footage in the background from today's era and even past eras, just so that way you can see the contrast in the style of play over these different eras. Now, when you do compare that though to today's players like James Harden, for example, who would dribble the air out the ball to score while the lane isn't actually clogged anymore because of the 3-second rule, I don't see how one could argue that the dribbling or the ball handling today is better when they have that much space. I mean, if players today have to do more dribbling, in my opinion, to score the same amount of points as players in the past had to with more room to operate, then it's not better to me. Now, to the point of shooting the basketball. I'm looking at this from several different components. So they are field goal percentage with mid-range shooting also in there, free throw, and then 3-point shooting. I'll do it by decade, comparing them all in these areas to see just how much today's players have evolved, if they truly have. And I'll start with the 90s for some context. So looking at field goal and mid-range shooting, and mid-range shooting I normally say is somewhere between 15 to 19 feet. As you can see here, they're all within 1 to 2 percentage points of one another when you look at it from, the 90s into today's players. Moving on to free throw and three-point shooting, again, it's much the same story as with the field goal and mid-range shooting. Keep in mind that the second half, or especially the 90s, I would even say the back half of the 90s and the 2000s, those were the slowest paced, most paint clogging eras in league history, and they still ended up close in shooting in these different metrics to today's era, where they have far less of the lanes being clogged up with bigs, and then spacing, of course, being just a plethora out there. Players back in the day being able to perform like this with the rules and the physicality the way it was, for me, speaks to just how much more skilled, in my opinion, again, those players were back in the day compared to these guys. I haven't even brought up the fact that a lot of those players back then had post moves, they had a pull-up jumper where they came off a pick, where a lot, and I do mean a lot, of players today just simply do not have that in their game. Now, I do know that, yes, a lot of that has been kind of legislated out of the game, right, because of analytics with the three ball. But still, if we're going to say more skilled, that's why at the beginning of this, I said you kind of have to judge players by their era and what they do or what they allow. But that said, to me, having those things is a lot more skilled than what they do today. Before I end this video though, there is one other point I want to bring up that I hear a lot, and that is every player on the team, all 15 of them, so from the starters all the way to the last guy on the bench, can shoot the basketball. And all I have to say about that is, well, it really doesn't matter. Since every player doesn't get into the game anyway, just like the 15th man back in the 90s, 2000s, or the 2010s, or any era for that matter, didn't get into the game. So bringing up that point really doesn't mean much in my opinion. But hey, I guess everyone is entitled to their opinion, just like mine, which is these players today are not as skilled as players in past eras. But let me know in the comments which era's players has more skills in your opinion. However, until the next video, I'll leave it here and I'll talk to you all later. Take care.